Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. This has been the second week of Victober, and as I mentioned last week, I'll be starting each of my weekly ramble videos this month with two special features. The first, I'll be recording in some sort of Victorian outfit, or a Victorian adjacent outfit. Last week you saw me in my nightgown, but this week you get a fantastic top hat and a vest, ones I borrowed from my spouse and son. We were just talking about where they might have acquired them originally. My first thought was that they might have picked them up at a local costume sale, either from the Washington Opera or from the Shakespeare Theater Company. But my spouse is pretty sure he found the hat at our favorite neighborhood thrift store, Value Village. I paired them with a favorite scarf, one you usually see on my head. In addition to these vaguely Victorian costumes, I'm starting each of these weekly rambles videos by telling you about the tea I'm drinking that day. This idea is copied directly from the excellent BookTube channel Taking Tea with Catherine, which I will link to below. This week I've chosen a tea that I hope will go with my outfit, and with the reading and watching I want to discuss today. The tea is, like last week, from Harney & Sons, and the specific blend is Black Cask Bourbon. I really love it, and I think this blend will be in my regular cold weather rotation as long as Harney & Sons continues to sell it. Usually I drink my tea unsweetened. Black Cask Bourbon unsweetened has quite a smoky undertone, not quite as much as Lapsang Souchong, but definitely pronounced. I drink it with a bit of milk. If you add a bit of sugar, the sweet bourbon flavor comes to the fore and is really a delicious treat. I'm drinking my tea in a large mug I tend to keep upstairs where my day room during the plague is, along with an electric kettle. The mug has both its own tea strainer and a ceramic lid. Very handy when I'm brewing something just for myself. I'm wearing this supposedly masculine attire and drinking bourbon tea, all in a tribute to the subject I've been reading about and watching videos about this week, Anne Lister, a woman living in the early decades of the 19th century who's often called the first modern lesbian. First, let me say that I chose to read some of her journal as a way to meet the Victober challenge to read letters or diaries from the Victorian period. I knew that most of Anne Lister's life was pre-Victorian, but she actually died after Victoria came to the throne, and I thought I would just read a few of the very last entries. Sadly, in the edition I have of Lister's journal entries, there are none from the Victorian period. Nevertheless, her story and the story of how her journals have been preserved is quite fascinating. Anne Lister lived during the Regency period in Halifax in West Yorkshire, really between the years when Jane Austen wrote and the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign. She kept an extensive diary, perhaps more than 3 times as long as the diary of Samuel Pepys, estimated to be 5 million words or so. About 20% of her journal is in code, what is, as I understand it, essentially an alphabet replacement code using Greek letters, algebraic signs, punctuation marks, etc., along with several marks with specific meanings of their own. Most of what is kept in code is the juicy bits about her romantic life and the details of her sexual life, in much the same way that Pepys marked down those details. Decades later, a relative of Anne Lister's, John Lister, found the diaries and partially decoded them. When he discovered the somewhat shocking contents of the encoded sections, his friend advised him to burn the books. John did not burn them, but he did hide them. The free expression of homosexuality was completely impossible at the time John found the letters, especially for men. I'm not sure exactly what the evidence is, but some have suggested that John was gay, and cultural perceptions at that time were that homosexuality was a heritable trait. In order to stay within the law, John Lister hid his sexual identity. The idea of bringing Anne Lister's diaries forward with the decoded sections would have cast a spotlight on his own identity, a spotlight he was desperate to avoid. So he hid the diaries away, but he did not burn them, as his friend suggested. Perhaps he knew how meaningful they would be to generations in the future. Interestingly, there was a Victorian novel about Anne Lister, published in 1872, The Mistress of Landale Hall by Rosa Kettle, which I've not been able to lay my hands on. While she does acknowledge that Lister said she would never marry a man, there's no mention of Lister's sexuality. I assume that is because the author was completely unaware of it, given that the diaries were encoded and, in fact, unavailable still, I think. If any of you happen to know more about this novel, I would love to hear about it. Luckily for us, a selection of Lister's diary entries were published in 2 volumes starting in the late 1980s. At first, many readers thought they were a hoax. It seemed almost unbelievable that a woman would write such a salacious diary and live such a daring life. But documentary evidence has very much supported the diary entries as scholars have looked into the history. In roughly 2010, a lovely film was made starring Maxine Peake. When it premiered, it was accompanied by a short documentary starring Sue Perkins of Great British Bake Off fame as the host. I'll link to online versions down below in the description box. And of course, most recently, Gentleman Jack, the television series made by BBC and HBO, has been released. And there have been 2 new biographies as well. One by Angela Stidell, a very readable and somewhat scholarly book, and the other by Anne Choma, more concerned with a specific link to the television series. I've poked through diary entries and a few pages of Stidell's biography and seen both the Perkins documentary and the 2010 film, as well as enjoyed the first few episodes of Gentleman Jack. I'm really looking forward to reading more soon. Anne Lister's same-sex romantic affairs started when she was quite young. She was expelled from boarding school because of an intense and sexually mature relationship with one of her fellow pupils. Over the following years, she had many short and longer-term connections with a variety of women, keeping track in her diary of the details of their sexual activities, including her autoerotic practices, as Helena Whitbred says. She often referred to sexual experiences as kisses, and tracked orgasms with X's in the margins of her diary. But Lister didn't just write about her sex life, as fascinating and surprising as that is to see written early in the 19th century. Lister also wrote a great deal about the social context of her life as a lesbian and as a powerful woman. One of my favorite parts of her romantic exploits is how she identified whether particular women might be receptive to her advances. What do you think of the author Byron? Or have you read Juvenal? Referring to the Roman poet who talks quite a bit about homosexuality. As an historian who's thought a lot about gender and sexuality, I think it's important to realize that the way we define identity today is not stable. In other words, in the past, people saw their identities in different ways and used different language. Similarly, it would be shocking if the ideas and language we use about gender and sexuality today does not change within our own lifetimes, possibly even change several times within our lifetimes. How people constructed their ideas of themselves is shaped by the world they lived in. The word lesbian was not, in fact, in regular use during Leicester's time. It had appeared in print before the Victorian period began, but it was not used by women-loving women at that point. There's no evidence that Lister would have ever thought of that particular word to define herself. What we do know is that she did not just think of her romantic relationships in the 19th century style of romantic friendships between women who might be married to men and accept traditional gender roles. Instead, she saw herself as adamantly different. She was connected to what we now call lesbian communities across England and across Europe in general, traveling to places like Paris and Rome, to visit other folks who thought of themselves as women-loving women. While she identified herself clearly as a woman, she also rejected much of the cultural construction of 19th century upper-class femininity. She wore mostly black, at a time when black attire was considered masculine, although in her case her black attire were women's bodices and long skirts. Her primary way of rejecting what was supposedly feminine was through her behavior, her romantic and sexual choices, and her business practices. In 1826, Anne Lister inherited the 400-acre Shibden Hall, a beautiful house with an estate full of coal, increasingly valuable as the Industrial Revolution spread throughout the Western world. Jeanette Winterson calls our attention to the famous sentence that begins Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Clearly, here we need a slight adjustment. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single woman in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And when Lister started looking, she found Anne Walker, the heiress, a woman she had known before. Lister seems to have started her pursuit of Walker more because of Walker's money and susceptibility than love, but their romance seems authentic as time goes on. In 1834, Anne Lister and Anne Walker celebrated what they saw as their marriage. They exchanged rings and vows at home, and then arranged to have a private ceremony at their church, where, as Lister wrote in her diary, they took sacrament together, took communion together. It's unclear if the church's religious leader was aware of how the two women perceived the ritual. Despite community discomfort with their untraditional lives, the people of their region basically accepted their positions, partly because relationships between women were not illegal, and not in general seen as problematic as adult sexual relationships between men, and partly because both women were financially independent. But things began to get complicated. Let me read to you what Jeanette Winterson says. Erotic intensity between women was not taken seriously in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Sometimes it was encouraged as a prelude to marriage, and in any case, women often shared a bed, so much so that a husband would not think it odd to vacate the marital bed when a special friend arrived on a visit. Touching and kissing were allowed to be a part of women's shared vocabulary. What was not allowed was any sense of a woman taking a man's role. To act like a man was taboo for a woman. Anne Lister did not really think of herself as acting like a man. Simply, she wanted to be independent, free-thinking, and crucially, to share her life with another woman. But such a conscious understanding of herself and her premeditated frank desires towards other women would and did get her into trouble. Anne Lister became more and more involved in the business of making an income from her property. As I mentioned a minute ago, she turned to coal mining on the estate, and in a very romantic gesture, she named the coal mine she sank on her land after her wife. She called it the Walker Pit. Many of the business-oriented men in the community were appalled by Lister's engagement in these kinds of supposedly masculine issues, and they ganged together to express their anger, burning both Lister and Walker in effigy. In the 2010 documentary, Sue Perkins points out that the men's response to the two women was, quote, a conflation of homophobia and misogyny, anger at the women's relationship with each other, and anger that the women were competing with their business ventures. Anne Lister seems not to have taken the burning in effigy too seriously, or let it slow her down in any way. She continued her financial activities on her land and refused to be intimidated. Despite all of this inspiring behavior, Lister can be a hard character to like sometimes. She was aggressive and almost predatory towards many women, it seems, as well as towards her business associates. She committed adultery regularly and seemed to take special pleasure in it. And she was intensely elitist. But despite these flaws, her story is one that has great importance as we sift through the past to try to understand the way gender worked, what was possible, how people created lives outside the supposed norms of gender roles and sexuality. Lister and Walker were global travelers, and on their travels, Lister often scaled mountains while wearing her skirts and silk stockings wildly. She was the first woman to successfully climb Mount Perdu, and the first person to officially reach the highest peak in the French Pyrenees, both climbs roughly 11,000 feet above sea level. That second peak even has a section named after her now, Lady Lister Pass. In late 1839, Lister and Walker traveled by carriage through Russia together, accompanied by 2 servants. They toured through areas of the country where few Western Europeans had traveled, sometimes needing a military escort to protect them from local protests against the Tsarist regime. While still traveling, Anne Lister contracted a fever, probably from a tick bite, and soon died. Her body was embalmed, and her partner and wife, Anne Walker, brought her body back to England, an undertaking that took roughly 6 months. She's buried in the parish church in Halifax. More than a century and a half later, Anne Lister is seen as a woman who defied society's gender limitations about loving relationships and about social position. She has become an early hero to many women, even those who recognize her flaws. In 2018, a plaque was installed at the church where Lister and Walker celebrated their marriage to each other. The wording of the plaque created quite a controversy. Under Anne Lister's name and her years of birth and death, the plaque read, "Gender Nonconforming Entrepreneur, celebrated marital commitment without legal recognition to Anne Walker in this church, Easter 1834." Lesbians who had long seen Anne Lister as proof of a long tradition of women loving women in England were disturbed that the plaque recognized only her gender nonconformity, but not explicitly her lesbian identity. They circulated a petition that garnered thousands of signatures, where they expressed frustration that other activists seemed to be claiming Anne Lister whole cloth. The petition read, quote, "Anne Lister was most definitely gender nonconforming all her life. She was also, however, a lesbian. Don't erase this iconic woman from our history." In 2019, the wording on the plaque was changed to explicitly acknowledge her love for women. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books for this second Victober weekly wrap-up. See you soon.